The house was less a home and more a mausoleum, a silent, dust-filled monument to a memory that refused to fade. Mark, now 45 but with the weary eyes of a much older man, moved through the rooms like a ghost haunting his own life. The walls were a chaotic collage of maps of the Cascade Mountain Range, crisscrossed with faded red lines marking search grids from a decade and a half ago, faded photographs of his sister Sarah, her husband David, and their children, Lily and Josh, smiled out from every surface, a family frozen in the amber of a perfect summer day in 2009. The air hung thick with the scent of old paper and stale coffee, the only sounds being the hum of the refrigerator and the quiet rhythmic tap of Mark's finger against a worn-out case file. This was his penance, his obsession, the solitary vigil for a family the world had long since forgotten. On a small television in the corner, a grainy home video flickered, its vibrant colors a stark contrast to the room's gray stillness. There was David, beaming with an infectious, almost boyish enthusiasm, his arm draped around his wife, Sarah. She smiled, her expression a familiar mix of love and gentle exasperation at his boundless optimism. In the background, 16-year-old Lily rolled her eyes with practiced teenage apathy, her fingers glued to a now ancient flip phone, while 10-year-old Josh, a blur of energy, chased the family dog across the freshly cut lawn. The footage was a window into a life of beautiful, mundane normalcy, a world of scraped knees, family dinners, and arguments over television channels. It was a perfect, ordinary moment, made excruciatingly precious by the silence that would soon follow it. Their home, a 2-story colonial on a quiet, tree-lined street, had been the epicenter of that vibrant life. Before the trip, it had hummed with a familiar, comforting energy. Sunlight streamed through the bay window in the living room, illuminating the scuff marks on the hardwood floors where Josh would skid in his socks. Lily's bedroom was a sanctuary of teenage angst, its walls covered in posters of bands no one remembered anymore, her desk a cluttered landscape of textbooks and makeup. In the kitchen, a calendar was still pinned to the corkboard, the month of July 2009 circled in red marker with Big Adventure scrawled in David's looping handwriting. It was a home filled with the small, tangible proofs of a life being lived, each object now a painful artifact of what was lost. The motorhome was David's pride and joy, a brand-new 2009 Coachman Freedom Express that he had bought with their savings. He spent the weeks leading up to their departure polishing its chrome accents until they gleamed and waxing its fiberglass exterior with meticulous care. He'd walk Josh through the vehicle, his voice filled with reverence as he demonstrated the pop-out living area and the compact efficiency of the galley kitchen. To David, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a vessel for the ultimate family bonding experience, a rolling home that would carry them through the majestic wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. It represented freedom, a break from routine, and the promise of memories that would last a lifetime, a promise that would be broken in the most unimaginable way. The final days before they left were a whirlwind of chaotic preparation, a symphony of slammed doors, excited shouts, and last-minute errands. Sarah moved through the house with a checklist, her brow furrowed in concentration as she packed first aid kits and enough non-perishable food to survive a minor apocalypse. David was outside, poring over paper maps of Washington State, tracing their intended route through the Cascade Mountains with a highlighter, blissfully unaware of the dead end it would become. Lily argued about the limited space for her luggage, while Josh tried to sneak his entire collection of action figures into his backpack. It was the beautiful, unscripted mess of a family on the verge of an adventure, their individual worries and excitements all woven into a single, shared tapestry of anticipation. As the motorhome finally pulled away from the curb, its massive engine a low rumble in the quiet morning air, a neighbor watering her lawn offered a friendly wave. The sun was bright, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of their suburban enclave. From his own porch next door, a younger Mark had watched them go, waving back at his nephew, who was making faces from the rear window. The image was burned into his memory, the gleaming white vehicle turning the corner, the flash of Sarah's smile, the entire scene bathed in the warm, hopeful light of a perfect summer morning. It was the last time he or anyone would ever see them again, a final peaceful moment before they drove straight into the heart of an enduring silent mystery. The initial euphoria of the open road had long since evaporated, replaced by the hypnotic drone of the motorhome's engine and the endless scroll of towering Douglas firs lining the highway. 3 days into their big adventure, the Cascade Mountains had enveloped them completely. David gripped the oversized steering wheel, his earlier ebullience tempered into a quiet, focused determination. Beside him, Sarah traced their progress on a creased paper map, a faint line of worry etched between her brows. In the back, the novelty had worn off for the children. Lily was lost in the tinny sound leaking from her headphones, while Josh stared blankly out the window, the majestic scenery now just a monotonous green blur. The vast, beautiful wilderness was beginning to feel less like a playground and more like an immense, silent ocean. It was David who broke the quiet rhythm, his finger tapping an almost invisible line on the map. "Here," he announced, a spark of his old excitement returning. "This old logging road. According to a forum I read, it's a shortcut that leads to a hidden overlook with the best view of the entire valley. It'll be an adventure, something just for us." Sarah leaned over, her expression skeptical, as she studied the faint, dotted line that veered sharply away from their planned route. "David, it's not marked as a public road. We don't know its condition, and the sun will be setting in a couple of hours. Maybe we should stick to the main road." Her voice was gentle, but the concern was unmistakable. From the back, Lily's voice dripped with practiced sarcasm. "Oh, great. Another one of Dad's famous shortcuts. Are we going to end up in another field talking to cows again?" David shot a mildly wounded look into the rearview mirror, but Josh piped up, his boredom instantly forgotten. "A secret road. Cool. Are there bears?" The brief family debate was settled by David's optimistic grin as he flicked the turn signal. With a heavy sigh from Sarah and a groan from Lily, David steered the lumbering motorhome off the smooth asphalt and onto the narrow, gravel-strewn path that disappeared ominously into the dense, dark woods. It was a single fateful decision, made with the best of intentions. The transition was immediate and jarring. The motorhome's tires crunched loudly on the loose gravel, and the branches of ancient moss-covered trees scraped against the vehicle's sides like skeletal fingers. Sunlight, which had been bright on the main road, was now filtered through a thick, suffocating canopy, casting the interior in a gloomy, submarine-like green light. The road was far rougher than David had anticipated, and with every jolt and dip, cabinets rattled and loose items clattered to the floor. The comforting hum of civilization was gone, replaced by the unsettling sounds of the deep forest. Their rolling home suddenly felt fragile and small, a tiny metal shell navigating a vast, indifferent wilderness that was quickly swallowing them whole. After 20 minutes of slow, bumpy travel, the road began to degrade further, the gravel giving way to long stretches of dark, slick mud. Sarah's grip on the dashboard tightened, her knuckles turning white. "David, this is a bad idea. We haven't had cell service for miles. What if we get stuck? No one would even know where to look for us." David's forced cheerfulness was starting to fray at the edges, his jaw tight with concentration as he navigated a particularly treacherous patch. "It'll be fine, Sarah. The forum said it gets better just up ahead. Almost there, I promise." But his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, a silent admission that his shortcut was rapidly turning into a serious miscalculation. The end came not with a dramatic crash, but with a sickening lurch and the sound of spinning tires, whining uselessly. The motorhome slid sideways into a deep, rain-soaked rut, its immense weight sinking it firmly into the thick, clay-like mud. David gunned the engine, but the vehicle only dug itself deeper. Finally, with a shudder and a cough, the engine stalled. The sudden absolute silence was deafening, broken only by the first drops of rain beginning to patter against the fiberglass roof. They were stranded. The majestic forest no longer looked beautiful. It looked like a cage, its towering trees the bars that held them captive, miles from any known road, with darkness rapidly approaching. A cold dread began to permeate the small space. David slammed his hand against the steering wheel, his optimism finally shattering into sharp-edged frustration. He climbed out, his boots making a disgusting sucking sound as they sank into the mud. Through the rain-streaked windshield, the children watched as their parents engaged in a tense, whispered argument. The words were indistinct, but the body language was clear. Sarah's desperate, pleading gestures, and David's grim, stubborn shaking of his head, the illusion of a perfect family adventure, had completely dissolved, leaving behind the raw, ugly reality of fear and blame. Inside, Lily and Josh remained silent, their own anxieties amplified by the sight of their parents' crumbling composure. As dusk bled into a moonless, starless night, the forest transformed. Every shape and shadow twisted into something monstrous and unfamiliar. The wind sighing through the pines sounded like a mournful whisper, and the snap of a distant twig could have been a footstep. The rain grew heavier, drumming a relentless, unnerving rhythm on the roof. Josh, who had earlier been excited by the prospect of bears, now sat with his knees pulled to his chest, his face pressed against the cold window, certain that every dark shape was a creature watching them from the impenetrable blackness between the trees. The isolation was absolute, a palpable force pressing in on them from all sides, suffocating them with its sheer silent immensity. After an hour of tense waiting, David made a choice. "I'm going to walk back," he announced, his voice strained but determined. "I'll follow our tracks. It can't be more than 5 or 6 miles to the main road. I'll flag someone down." Sarah's protest was immediate and frantic. "No, David, you can't go out there in the dark in this rain. It's not safe. We should just wait here together until morning." But he was resolute, convinced it was their only option. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and a jacket, gave his wife a quick, tense kiss, and told the children he loved them. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the storm, his flashlight beam a lonely spear of light that was quickly swallowed by the oppressive, waiting darkness. Inside the motorhome, the atmosphere was thick with a new, more profound terror. Sarah, Lily, and Josh were now alone. Their protector and leader vanished into the hostile night. Sarah's attempt to project calm was a fragile facade. She dealt a hand of cards onto the small dining table, but her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold them. Her eyes, wide and fearful, kept darting towards the door, as if expecting David to reappear at any moment. Lily had abandoned her tough exterior entirely, her arm wrapped tightly around her little brother's shoulders. The only sounds were the relentless drumming of the rain and their own ragged, shallow breaths, each one a countdown in the suffocating, silent darkness. An hour stretched into 2, then 3. The flashlight beam never returned. Just as a fragile, exhausted sleep began to claim them, a new sound cut through the rhythm of the storm. It was a low, deliberate scraping coming from the rear of the motorhome. It was a grating, metallic sound, like something heavy being dragged slowly across the vehicle's exterior. Sarah's blood ran cold. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was methodical, rhythmic, and intelligent. She put a finger to her lips, her eyes locking with Lily's, conveying a silent, desperate command to be completely still. The rain, their only companion for hours, now seemed to muffle a threat that was just inches away. The scraping noise stopped as abruptly as it had begun, plunging them back into a silence that was somehow more terrifying. A full minute passed, each second an eternity. Then it came. A single, sharp, heavy rap on the main door. It wasn't the sound of a human fist. It was a solid, resonant thud, impossibly loud over the storm. Sarah clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream, pulling her children into a tight, trembling huddle on the floor. It couldn't be David. He would have called out. It couldn't be a rescuer. Who was out there? The knock came again, harder this time, a brutal, impatient summons that vibrated through the floor, a definitive, horrifying announcement that their ordeal had just begun. The first year was a blur of frantic action that slowly curdled into a thick, suffocating dread. In the months following the disappearance, Mark had been a constant presence at the search command post, a gaunt figure fueled by black coffee and the thinnest sliver of hope. He studied the topographic maps with an intensity that unnerved the seasoned volunteers, his finger tracing every ravine and logging road as if he could will his family into existence. But as the seasons turned, the official search wound down. The teams packed their gear, offering him sympathetic but final handshakes. For them, it was the end of a tragic operation. For Mark, it was the lonely, horrifying beginning of a lifelong vigil, a promise made to the silent, smiling faces in the photographs that now littered his car's dashboard. The silence that followed the official search was more deafening than any siren. Media attention dwindled from national headlines to brief mentions in local papers, and then to nothing at all. The world, it seemed, had the capacity to forget, to move on to the next tragedy. Mark could not. His weekends were no longer his own. They belonged to the Cascades. He'd drive for hours before dawn, his old pickup truck loaded with survival gear and stacks of maps, and hike until his legs burned and his lungs ached. He was searching not just for them, but for an escape from the crushing guilt of his own quiet life, a life that continued while theirs had simply stopped. Each snapped twig in the oppressive silence of the forest sounded like a clue, and every disappointment was a fresh wound. Guilt was a constant, unwelcome companion, often manifesting in vivid, torturous flashbacks. He would be driving, and suddenly he was back on his porch a week before their trip. Sarah had called him, her voice tight with a familiar anxiety. "David wants to explore some of these old, unmarked roads," she'd said. "He thinks it'll be an adventure." "I just have a bad feeling, Mark." He remembered his casual, dismissive response. "He's a big kid, Sarah. You know that. Just let him have his fun. You guys deserve a break." The memory was a hot poker in his gut. He hadn't listened. He had told her to relax. Now every step he took through the unforgiving wilderness felt like an act of penance for that single, unforgivable failure. 3 years after they vanished, the case was officially declared cold. Detective Miller, a man whose face had become as familiar to Mark as his own reflection, delivered the news over a cup of bitter coffee in a sterile conference room. The words were clinical, resources reallocated, no new leads, active but not prioritized, but their impact was brutal. It was the system's official surrender. Mark felt a cold, hard anger crystallize in his chest. As Miller spoke of budget cuts and statistical probabilities, Mark realized he was truly alone. The authorities had closed their files, but his remained wide open, a gaping wound on his dining room table. The world might be done looking, but he was just getting started. The next few years saw his obsession fully consume him. His house, once a bachelor pad, slowly transformed into a grim headquarters for a one-man investigation. Maps wallpapered the living room, connected by a spiderweb of red yarn marking search areas, potential routes, and points of interest. Case files and news clippings were stacked on every surface, a monument to his failure. Friends stopped calling. Their invitations to dinners and parties met with polite but firm refusals. They saw a man drowning in grief, but he saw them as deserters. How could they laugh? How could they plan for the future when Sarah, David, Lily, and Josh were still out there, suspended in a state of terrifying uncertainty? His isolation was a fortress he had built brick by brick. He was haunted not by ghosts, but by the vibrant, specific details of lives interrupted. He remembered Josh, a whirlwind of energy and scraped knees, and the afternoon he'd spent teaching him to tie his shoes. The boy's small hands had struggled with the laces, his brow furrowed in concentration, and then the sudden, triumphant grin when he finally made the perfect bow. Mark would find himself staring at a pair of small, worn-out sneakers he'd found in Josh's closet, imagining them caked in forest mud. These memories were not comforting. They were agonizingly sharp, constant reminders of the tangible, breathing human beings who had been erased, turning his abstract search into a deeply personal, visceral mission to recover a piece of his own heart. The 10th anniversary was a particularly cruel milestone. A local news channel ran a 2-minute retrospective, Remembering the Hendersons segment, complete with the same smiling family photos and grainy footage of the initial search. Mark watched it, his expression unreadable, his insides churning with a decade of accumulated rage and sorrow. He spent that day, like every anniversary, locked in his house, rereading every witness statement, every police report, convinced he had missed something. The hope of finding them alive had long since withered into a fragile, desperate need for answers. He just wanted to know what happened. He wanted a place to grieve, a stone to put flowers on, an end to the unending question mark that had become his life. The financial toll was staggering, a slow bleed that had drained his savings and forced him to take on a second mortgage. He'd hired private investigators who took his money and delivered nothing but platitudes. He'd spent thousands on helicopter flyovers of remote canyons, staring down at an impenetrable sea of green until his eyes burned. His body, too, was paying the price. The fit, easygoing man of 15 years ago was gone, replaced by a lean, hardened figure with a permanent limp from a fall during a solo search and a face etched with the lines of chronic stress and sleeplessness. He had sacrificed everything, his finances, his health, his future, placing it all on the altar of his unyielding obsession. He often thought of Lily, the sarcastic, eye-rolling teenager who had hidden a deep well of sensitivity beneath her tough exterior. He remembered finding her diary once while helping them move a bookshelf. He hadn't read it, but he saw the pages filled with her cramped, passionate handwriting and sketches in the margins. What poems was she writing now? What kind of woman would she have become? Would she have traveled the world or become a doctor or fallen in love? This was a different, more insidious kind of grief, the mourning for a future that had been stolen. It wasn't just about finding what was lost, but about the infinite, heartbreaking possibilities of what could have been, a void of potential that ached as much as the absence itself. In the 12th year, a flicker of hope ignited only to be brutally extinguished. A pair of hikers far off any marked trail discovered the tattered remains of a campsite, a rusted cooking pot, and a rotted piece of a nylon tent. For one agonizing week, the world remembered the Hendersons again. News vans parked outside Mark's house. The local sheriff, a young man who had been in high school when the family vanished, reopened the file with a reluctant energy. Mark allowed himself to feel a surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. But forensic analysis proved the items were from the 1980s. The crash back into the cold, silent reality of his life was the most painful yet, a cruel lesson in the anatomy of false hope. There were nights, submerged in the tomb-like silence of his house, when Mark would question his own sanity. Staring at the smiling faces on the wall, he wondered if his quest was a noble tribute or a slow, methodical form of self-destruction. Had he honored their memory, or had he allowed their disappearance to claim another victim? The man he used to be was a distant stranger. He was now defined solely by their absence. He was Sarah's brother, Lily, and Josh's uncle, a man trapped in a perpetual loop of the last day he saw them, the wave from the motorhome window, the glint of the sun on the chrome, a perfect moment that had become the opening scene of an endless nightmare. As the world hurtled forward, Mark remained stuck in 2009, but technology was evolving, and he grudgingly evolved with it. The man who once relied on compasses and paper maps now spent his nights hunched over a laptop, scrolling through high-resolution satellite images on public databases and lurking in online forums dedicated to cold cases and missing persons. He learned about ground-penetrating radar and the burgeoning field of civilian drone photography. These new tools didn't spark hope, not anymore, but they offered new angles of attack, new ways to scrutinize the vast, indifferent wilderness that held his family captive. It was a faint, digital glimmer in the analog darkness of his 15-year search. On a cold autumn afternoon, he visited Detective Miller, now long retired and living in a small house filled with the smell of old books and peppermint. Miller was frail, his memory a flickering candle, but the Henderson case was a name that still struck a chord deep within him. He shuffled to his garage and returned with a dusty cardboard box filled with his personal, unofficial notes, hunches, dead-end theories, and interviews that never made the official file. "It was the one that got away," Miller rasped, his voice thin. "Maybe you'll see something I didn't." It felt like a benediction, a passing of a heavy haunted torch from one weary man to another. On the eve of the 15th anniversary, Mark stood before his wall of maps. The ink had faded, the paper was brittle, and the faces in the photographs seemed to be receding further into the past. 15 years. An entire childhood for a boy like Josh. A whole life for a young woman like Lily. The fire of his initial rage had long ago burned down to embers, leaving a constant, profound ache that was now simply a part of him. He no longer expected a miracle. He no longer listened for the sound of their motorhome pulling into the driveway. All he wanted now was the truth. He was a sentinel at a forgotten tomb, waiting for a sign, any sign, from the crushing, impenetrable silence. It was a different kind of obsession that led to the breakthrough. Chloe, a 22-year-old with an artist's eye and a technophile's budget, saw the Cascades not as a graveyard of secrets, but as an untamed canvas. From her remote campsite, she launched her top-of-the-line aerial drone, its quiet hum a stark contrast to the profound silence of the wilderness. She was hunting for the perfect shot, a cinematic sweep of a hidden waterfall she'd pinpointed on a satellite map deep within a section of the national park known for its treacherous, inaccessible terrain. The drone soared high above the canopy, a tiny, godlike eye gazing down upon the endless, undulating sea of ancient green, a landscape that had swallowed a family whole 15 years prior. The anomaly appeared on her controller's high-definition screen as a flicker of unnatural light, a single discordant note in nature's perfect symphony. Amidst the organic chaos of greens and browns, something reflected the midday sun with a geometric precision that didn't belong. It was a faint, almost imperceptible glint. Her curiosity piqued, Chloe abandoned the waterfall and expertly piloted the drone downwards, her fingers dancing across the controls. She navigated the machine through a narrow gap in the towering firs, descending into the perpetual twilight of the forest floor. The signal was choppy, the image breaking up as the drone dipped below the thickest part of the canopy, but the glint was becoming a shape. As the feed stabilized, the shape resolved into a sight that made the breath catch in her throat. There, at the bottom of a steep, narrow ravine, lay a large vehicle half swallowed by the earth and a decade's worth of rampant vegetation. It rested at an unnatural angle, its side caved in, its white paint peeled and stained with rust and moss. Thick vines snaked through a shattered window, anchoring it to the forest floor as if nature itself were trying to digest it. It was a tomb of faded fiberglass and rotting tires, a man-made scar on the landscape, perfectly hidden from any casual glance from above or any search party on the ground. It was an impossible, forgotten thing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, She landed the drone, its whirring blades spinning down into an unnerving silence. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone, the single bar of service a minor miracle. She typed, "Motorhome missing Cascades," into the search bar. The first result was a grainy news photo from 2009, the Henderson family smiling in front of their brand-new Coachman Freedom Express. She zoomed in on the photo, then back to the captured drone image on her controller. The faded blue stripe, the specific placement of the windows, the shape of the chrome grille. It was a perfect match. This wasn't just an abandoned wreck. This was the Hendersons' rolling coffin, a 15-year-old mystery she had just stumbled upon from 2 miles away. The phone call to the sheriff's office was a surreal experience. She tried to keep her voice steady, explaining who she was and what she had found, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of adrenaline and awe. The dispatcher on the other end was initially dismissive, his tone saturated with the weary skepticism of someone who had heard every crank theory and false lead over the years. But as Chloe calmly read out the GPS coordinates and described the specific model of the motorhome, the dispatcher's bored monotone sharpened into focused attention. A long silence followed, filled only with the sound of frantic typing. A cold case, dormant for 15 years, had just been violently reawakened. For Mark, the phone call was an earthquake that shattered the tectonic plates of his carefully constructed, grief-stricken world. He was staring at his wall of maps when the unfamiliar number flashed on his screen. The voice on the other end was young, professional, and cautious. "Mr. Thompson," the detective began, "we've received a credible report concerning the location of a vehicle that matches the description of your sister's motorhome." The words didn't compute at first. They were a language from a forgotten time, from an era when hope was still a possibility. Then the meaning crashed over him, a physical force that buckled his knees and stole the air from his lungs. He sank into a chair, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned to bone. He barely registered the rest of the conversation, his mind a maelstrom of shock, terror, and a fragile, agonizing flicker of hope he thought had died years ago. A drone, a ravine, an area he had marked on his own map with a skull and crossbones, a place too steep and dense for his aging body to ever attempt alone. After the call ended, he remained frozen, staring at the smiling face of his nephew, Josh, in a framed photograph. For the first time in over a decade, the question was not where they were, but what he would find. The crushing weight of 15 years of unknowing was suddenly rivaled by the unbearable terror of a potential answer, an answer that could be so much worse than the silence. The recovery site was a scene of controlled chaos, a modern technological intrusion into a place that time had forgotten. Mark stood behind a line of yellow tape, a ghost at a feast of grim discovery. The air hummed with the growl of generators and the shouts of officials. He watched as a massive crane, its arm extended like the limb of a metallic beast, lowered a set of thick straps into the ravine's dark maw. The sheer steepness of the gorge was terrifying. It was a straight drop, a place you wouldn't just crash into, but fall into. It explained why no one had ever found it. It was a flaw in the earth that had served as the perfect hiding place for his family's final moments. The ascent was agonizingly slow. The motorhome groaned in protest as it was lifted from its earthen grave, shedding dirt, leaves, and twisted branches. It rose above the tree line, a mangled, moss-covered relic dangling in the afternoon sun. The damage was severe. One entire side crumpled like a discarded can, a testament to the violence of its fall. Yet it was undeniably theirs. Mark recognized the faded decal of an eagle near the rear window, a detail David had been so proud of. As it was gently lowered onto a massive flatbed truck, a profound, expectant silence fell over the entire crew. The first part of the mystery was solved. Now came the part that truly mattered, the part that had haunted Mark's every waking moment. The forensics team, clad in white suits, swarmed the vehicle. The immediate focus was the main door. It was warped and jammed in its frame, sealed shut by the impact and 15 years of rust and corrosion. An officer approached with a Halligan bar, the heavy piece of steel looking like a brutal key to a forbidden chamber. Mark's breath hitched. He felt a desperate, conflicting urge to look away and to see everything. This was it. The culmination of his life's work, of his unending vigil, was contained in that rusted metal box. The answer to everything was just on the other side of that door, waiting in the dark, stale air. The metallic screech of the bar prying the door open was a sound that would be seared into Mark's memory forever. It was a final, agonizing groan of protest before the rusted lock gave way. With a shuddering pop, the door swung open, releasing a palpable wave of musty, stagnant air, the smell of time itself. The lead investigator aimed a high-powered flashlight into the dark interior, sweeping the beam across the small space. He paused, his expression unreadable behind his mask. He slowly pulled his head back out, looked over at the sheriff, and then his gaze landed on Mark. He said nothing, but his message was brutally clear in the slow, deliberate shake of his head. The hope that had so cruelly bloomed in Mark's chest withered and died in an instant, replaced by a cold, hollowing dread that was far worse than the familiar ache of grief. It wasn't relief. It wasn't closure. It was a new, more terrifying chapter of the nightmare. The lead investigator walked over, his voice low and somber. "It's empty, Mark. The vehicle is completely empty. There's no sign of them, no remains. It's like they just vanished from inside." The motorhome wasn't a tomb, it was just another clue, a massive screaming question mark dropped into the center of his life, proving only one thing: the fall into the ravine hadn't been the end of their story, it had only been the beginning. The motorhome, once a symbol of adventure and freedom, now sat under the cold, sterile lights of a police forensic garage. It looked like a beached whale, a dead thing from another time, its mossy exterior a stark contrast to the clean concrete floor. Mark stood behind a pane of reinforced glass in a small viewing room, a designated space for grieving families that felt more like a cage. He watched as technicians in white suits moved around the vehicle with a detached, clinical precision, their movements methodical and quiet. The transition from the wild, untamed ravine to this antiseptic tomb was jarring, and it only amplified his sense of helpless isolation. He was closer to the truth than ever, yet separated from it by a wall of glass and protocol. Leading the newly reopened investigation was Detective Harding, a man half Mark's age with sharp eyes and an air of quiet competence that bordered on coldness. He didn't carry the weary weight of the case's history like retired Detective Miller. To him, it was a complex puzzle, not a personal tragedy. "We need to manage expectations, Mark," Harding had said, his voice even. 15 years of exposure can destroy evidence. We'll be thorough, but we can't promise answers." "Yeah," Mark nodded numbly, understanding the words but resenting their implication. For Harding, this was a file brought back from the archives. For Mark, this was the final, desperate excavation of his own soul, and he feared there would be nothing left to find. The initial reports from inside the motorhome painted a picture of eerie, mundane normalcy abruptly halted. On the small dining table, a deck of cards was fanned out mid-game. In the galley, a half-empty bag of potato chips was clipped shut. Taped to a kitchen cabinet was a child's drawing of a stick-figure family standing next to a boxy RV under a smiling sun, signed with the backward S of 10-year-old Josh. Every mundane object was a gut punch, a ghost of a life interrupted. It was a time capsule of their last peaceful moments, a silent testament to the fact that they had not anticipated the end. They were simply living, right up until the moment they weren't. The forensic team's preliminary findings only deepened the enigma. They dusted every surface, combed every fiber, and analyzed every stain. But the story they found was one of absence. Aside from the obvious damage from the fall into the ravine, there were no signs of a violent struggle inside the vehicle. No blood spatter, no overturned furniture, no indication of a fight. It was as if the Hendersons had been present one moment and had simply evaporated the next. This lack of evidence was, in itself, the most terrifying clue yet. It ruled out the chaotic scenarios Mark had imagined for years and replaced them with something more chillingly deliberate, something quieter and far more sinister. The first concrete piece of the new puzzle came from the main door. A specialist examining the lock mechanism found something that made him call Harding over immediately. The frame around the latch was warped and scarred with deep, gouging scratches. The damage wasn't consistent with the crash. It was a clear indication of forced entry from the outside. The mark suggested a tool, something like a crowbar, had been used with significant brutal force to pry the door open, while it was locked from within. The implication was immediate and horrifying. After the crash, after they were trapped and alone in the dark, someone or something had tried, and apparently succeeded, in getting in. Mark felt the ground shift beneath him as Harding explained the finding. For 15 years, his narrative of their disappearance had been one of tragedy, a story of a family lost to the unforgiving wilderness after a terrible accident. He had imagined them succumbing to the elements, a sad but natural end. This new evidence, however, twisted that narrative into something monstrous. They weren't just lost, they were hunted. A new emotion, one he hadn't felt with such intensity since the first year, surged through him, a white-hot, vengeful rage. The faceless, indifferent forest was no longer the villain. Now there was a real, tangible evil at the heart of his family's story, and it had a human shape. Detective Harding, meanwhile, was fighting his own battles. Reopening a 15-year-old cold case was a bureaucratic nightmare. Resources were tight, and his superiors were skeptical, viewing the investigation as a costly, low-probability endeavor fueled by a media flare-up. Harding had to argue for every hour of the digital forensics team's time, for every specialized analysis of the degraded evidence. This resistance from within the department created a frustrating sense of pressure. The trail was colder than ice, and the window to find any meaningful answers felt like it was closing with every tick of the clock, every budget meeting he was forced to attend, a constant reminder that the world had moved on. The team methodically cataloged every item. In the driver's side door panel they found David's wallet. It was swollen and mildewed, but the contents were intact: credit cards, a driver's license, and over $200 in cash. Robbery was an unlikely motive. This discovery aligned with the theory that David had left the vehicle to find help. However, the heavy-duty high-lumen flashlight he'd bought specifically for the trip was nowhere to be found, confirming he had taken it with him into the night. He had walked out of that motorhome and into the dark, equipped and determined, but had never returned. He was the first to be swallowed by the woods. In the back, in the small bunk bed area that had belonged to Lily, an investigator carefully lifted a rotted pillow. Beneath it was a small, spiral-bound notebook, its cover warped into a wavy, unrecognizable shape. It was her journal. Mark's heart seized in his chest. He remembered her scribbling in it constantly, guarding it with a teenager's fierce sense of privacy. He had always wondered what thoughts and dreams were contained within those pages. Now that waterlogged book felt like the most important artifact on Earth, a potential message in a bottle from his niece, a voice reaching out across a 15-year chasm of silence to finally tell him what happened. The hope the journal inspired was almost immediately crushed. Years of dampness and decay had fused most of the pages into a solid, pulpy block. The ink had bled into illegible Rorschach blots. The lab technicians managed to carefully separate only a few fragments from the final pages. Most of it was what one would expect: complaints about having no cell service, annoyance with her little brother, a longing to be back with her friends. But the very last legible sentence, scrawled in a hurried, messy script, sent a chill through the entire investigation team. It read, "Dad's shortcut is a mistake. This place feels wrong, like we're being watched." That single line, "like we're being watched," was a bombshell. It recontextualized everything. Their fear hadn't begun when the motorhome got stuck, or when David left, or when the knock came on the door. It had started earlier. It suggested a creeping dread, a sense of being observed by an unseen presence in the woods long before their situation became a crisis. Harding, who had remained professionally detached, now looked at the case with a new, grave intensity. For Mark, the words were a form of torture, conjuring the image of his niece, isolated and afraid, sensing a danger that her parents, in their focus on the road, had tragically overlooked. The ultimate breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A junior technician, tasked with the tedious job of emptying every storage compartment, felt something lodged deep in the back of an overhead bin designed for camera equipment. He pulled out a small hard-shell Pelican case. It was caked in grime, but its rubber seal had remained mostly intact. He clicked open the latches. Inside, nestled in protective foam, was David's Sony Handycam, the very one he had used to film the family barbecue just weeks before they left. The camera itself was corroded and useless, but the small digital memory card was still seated in its slot, a tiny plastic rectangle holding an ocean of secrets. An almost unbearable tension descended as the memory card was rushed to the digital forensics lab. The process of recovering data from a device that had been exposed to 15 years of extreme temperature fluctuations and moisture was incredibly delicate. A single misstep could erase the only remaining eyewitness account. Mark and Harding waited in a sterile office, the silence broken only by the hum of a computer. Mark stared at the wall, his hands clenched into fists. This was it. Everything, the search, the obsession, the sacrifice, had led to this tiny piece of technology. It was either the key that would finally unlock his prison of uncertainty or the final definitive proof that the truth was lost forever. Hours later, the phone on Harding's desk rang, its shrill sound making Mark flinch. Harding listened intently, his expression unreadable, before hanging up. "They got something," he said, his voice quiet. "The card was heavily corrupted, but they managed to recover a single video file. It's from the end of the tape, recorded on the night they disappeared." He turned his laptop towards Mark as the encrypted file downloaded. "It's only 57 seconds long. The audio is distorted, and the video is extremely dark." "Are you sure you want to see this?" Mark could only nod, his throat too tight to speak, bracing himself for the ghosts he had spent 15 years searching for. The laptop screen flickered to life, bathing Mark's and Harding's faces in a cold blue light. The 57 seconds began. The image was a chaotic mess of deep shadows and grainy digital noise shot from inside the motorhome. The camera was shaking violently, held by a trembling hand. Through the distorted audio, the relentless drumming of rain on the roof was a constant, oppressive rhythm. Brief, panicked glimpses of faces appeared in the gloom. Sarah, her eyes wide with terror, clutching a sobbing Josh to her chest. Lily was visible for a moment, her back pressed against a wall, her face a pale, frozen mask of disbelief. A low-battery icon blinked with cruel insistence in the corner of the frame, a tiny digital countdown to oblivion. Mark leaned closer, his knuckles white, as he gripped the edge of the desk, trying to pierce the 15 years of darkness. The soundscape was a nightmare. Layered beneath the storm and Josh's muffled cries was the distinct, grating noise of metal scraping against metal, the same sound the forensic team had described. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and circled the vehicle, a predator testing the walls of its cage. The camera, presumably held by Sarah, whipped towards a side window, but the darkness outside was absolute, offering only a distorted reflection of the terror within. Sarah's voice, a raw, desperate whisper, cut through the static. He's still out there. Oh God, he's still out there. Her words weren't a question. They were a statement of horrifying certainty. The family wasn't just stranded, they were besieged, trapped in their metal shell by an unseen, patient menace. Then came the knock. It wasn't a sound of inquiry. It was a brutal, percussive impact that made the camera jump. Sarah gasped, clamping a hand over her own mouth. The camera swung wildly, finally focusing on the main door, the thin metal vibrating from the force of the blow. The flimsy lock seemed impossibly fragile, a pathetic defense against the violence on the other side. The knock came again, louder and more insistent, a sound of pure, malevolent intent. In that moment, Mark felt a chilling connection across time, becoming a helpless spectator to the final, terrifying moments he had spent a decade and a half trying to imagine. The reality captured in this grainy footage was infinitely more horrifying than any scenario his grief-stricken mind had ever conjured. The camera's view suddenly stabilized, the frame skewed. Sarah had apparently set it down on the table, pointing it directly at the door, a silent, desperate witness. The family was now out of shot, but their ragged, shallow breaths filled the audio track, a chorus of pure fear. The scraping noise returned, now concentrated around the door handle, more frantic and focused than before. The metal frame began to groan, and under the pressure of what must have been a prying tool, the edge of the door started to visibly bend inward. Mark stared, his own lungs burning, every protective instinct screaming at the silent screen, a futile rage building in his chest as he watched the inevitable, horrific breach of his family's final sanctuary. With a final deafening shriek of tearing metal, the lock shattered, and the door was violently ripped open. The gaping doorway was a black maw, a void against the stormy night. A figure stepped through the breach, silhouetted and immense. It was not some mythical beast of the forest, but something far more terrifying. A man. He was tall and gaunt, draped in layers of dark, tattered clothing that seemed to absorb the light. His face was a nest of matted hair and beard, but his eyes, for a single horrifying second, caught the faint red recording light of the camera and reflected it with a flat predatory gleam. He stood perfectly still in the doorway, saying nothing, his silent presence radiating a cold, absolute authority that was more terrifying than any weapon. The final seconds of the footage descended into pure chaos. The man took a slow, deliberate step into the motorhome. A choked, guttural scream was torn from Sarah's throat before being abruptly cut off. The camera was knocked from its perch, tumbling to the floor. The last images were a sickening, dizzying blur of the dirty linoleum, the leg of the table, and the dark, heavy boots of the intruder. Over the sounds of a desperate, muffled struggle, a child's voice cried out, "Mommy!" Then another voice, this one belonging to the intruder, a man's voice, eerily calm and low, spoke two chilling words that echoed through the static. "Be still." A final sharp gasp, and the screen went black as the battery died, plunging the room into a profound, suffocating silence. Mark remained motionless, staring at the blank, dark screen. The silence in the office was heavier and more absolute than the 15 years of silence he had endured before. The truth he had sacrificed his life to find was not a tragic accident or a story of survival gone wrong. It was an execution. It was a kidnapping. It was a man with cold eyes and a calm voice who had stepped out of the darkness and stolen his family. Detective Harding slowly, quietly, closed the laptop, the soft click of the lid and inadequate punctuation to the horror they had just witnessed. The case wasn't closed. It had just been reborn. Mark finally lifted his gaze from the screen, and the deep familiar ache of grief in his eyes had been replaced by something new, the cold, hard, and terrifyingly sharp glint of vengeance. The laptop screen was a black mirror, reflecting a man Mark no longer recognized. The ghost of grief that had haunted his features for 15 years had been burned away, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of a man who had stared into the abyss and seen a face staring back. Detective Harding finally broke the heavy silence, his voice strained. "We have a face, we have a voice. It's not much, but it's a start." For Harding, it was the beginning of a manhunt. For Mark, it was the end of one life and the start of another. He had spent a decade and a half searching for a tragedy. Now he understood he was hunting a monster. The question was no longer what happened to his family, but who. And Mark knew, with a terrifying clarity that settled deep in his bones, that he would be the one to find him. The recovered footage was a firestorm. Leaked to the press, the 57 seconds of grainy terror transformed the Henderson family from a forgotten local tragedy into a national horror story. The silhouetted figure in the doorway became a modern boogeyman. The Cascade Phantom, his two whispered words, "Be still," the stuff of nightmares. News vans once again camped outside Mark's house, but he remained silent, a recluse in his own home. The public's morbid fascination felt like a violation, a spectacle made of his family's final agonizing moments. He had wanted the world to remember them, but not like this, not as victims in a viral clip, their fear consumed as entertainment. He shut the blinds, turned off the television, and let the world's noise fade, focusing only on the cold, quiet hum of his own singular, newly defined purpose. Within a month, the house was sold. The wall of maps, the shrine of yarn and faded photographs, was dismantled piece by piece. It was not an act of surrender, but one of grim liberation. Mark was no longer a keeper of a tomb. He was a hunter, sharpening his tools for the chase. He moved into a small, anonymous apartment, its bare walls a stark contrast to his old home. With the proceeds from the sale, he hired private investigators, not to find his family's remains, but to build a profile of their killer. He pored over cold cases from the Pacific Northwest, searching for a pattern, a whisper of the same calm, predatory evil. His obsession had not ended with the discovery. It had merely evolved, shedding its skin of grief to reveal the raw, unyielding muscle of vengeance beneath. 2 years crawled by, a period of agonizingly slow progress and countless dead ends. Then a call came from Harding, who had never let the case go. A partial fingerprint, lifted from the bent metal of the motorhome's doorframe, had finally gotten a hit. It was a long shot, a match from a recent arrest in Oregon for poaching. The name was Elias Thorne, a drifter with no fixed address, a man who had lived off the grid for decades, a ghost in the system. The file photo showed an older, gaunt man with a wild beard and eyes that seemed to look right through the camera, eyes that held the same flat, cold emptiness Mark had seen reflected in the camcorder's recording light. It was him. The Phantom had a name. Mark didn't wait for warrants or task forces. He took the name and the last known location from Harding's unofficial tip and drove north. His old pickup truck ate up the miles, carrying him back to the same mountains that had stolen everything from him. This time, however, he was not entering the woods as a desperate man searching for ghosts, but as an equal, a predator hunting another. He was older, his body scarred by years of his relentless search, but his spirit was forged from something harder than steel. He parked at a forgotten trailhead, deep in the national forest, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. He shouldered a small pack, his face set like stone, and walked into the vast, indifferent wilderness, following the faint trail of a monster. The final chapter of Mark's story was never written in an official police report. His truck was found a week later, empty, a cold cup of coffee on the dash. Some say he was lost to the same wilderness that claimed his family, a final tragic victim of his own obsession. Others, those who knew the cold fire in his eyes, believe he found Elias Thorne. They imagine a final silent confrontation deep within the ancient woods, far from the eyes of the world, where a 15-year-old debt was finally paid. The forest keeps its secrets. its deep silence swallowing both the innocent and the vengeful. For the world, the Henderson case remains a chilling, open question. But for Mark, the ending was never about closure. It was about a promise, a final quiet act in the heart of the darkness.